The doors did not open. They crashed. Both of the heavy double doors of the Maricopa County Superior Courtroom swung inward and sent papers scattering from the prosecution table. Every head in the packed gallery turned. The air conditioning kept running. The clock on the wall kept moving. But every person inside that sterile, fluorescent-lit room went completely still. Because what walked through those doors was not a lawyer. It was a horse. Jet black, covered chest to flank in the rust-red dust of the Sonoran Desert. Sweat dried in pale salt lines across its neck. It placed one massive hoof onto the pristine gray courtroom carpet and stopped. Its dark eyes moved across the room without fear and without hurry, the way the desert itself moves. It simply held its ground. On its saddle hung two things. A Winchester rifle, its wooden stock polished smooth by decades of careful handling, and a framed photograph, dusty at the edges, tied to the saddle horn with a length of leather cord. In it, a small girl stood in a field of yellow desert grass, squinting into the Arizona sun, holding the large, calloused hand of a young man whose face was turned just far enough from the camera that you could not quite name him. Walking beside that horse, his left hand resting loosely on the animal's neck, was a man named Elric Vane. He was 60 years old, and every one of those years was written in the landscape of his face. Not the smile of a man who has won something at someone else's expense. What crossed his face as he walked into that courtroom was the quieter, more unsettling expression of a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally, at long last, set it down. His wrists were bound in heavy steel handcuffs. He did not appear to notice them at all. One measured pace behind him walked US Marshal Marcus Vance. His charcoal suit was perfectly pressed. His leather boots struck the marble without hurry. He held his gold federal badge open in his right hand, raised at shoulder height, and he was looking directly at the courtroom security officers who had surged to their feet with their hands moving toward their holsters. "Federal authority," he said. Not loudly. "Stand down." They stood down. At the prosecution table, Victoria Sterling had risen from her chair. She had been preparing this case for 8 months. The civil asset proceeding against one Elric Vane, designated fugitive and desert squatter, brought on behalf of her grandparents' real estate empire. She had the evidence. She had the precedent. She had the briefs and the favorable case law and 2 senior partners behind her. She should have been untouchable at that moment. There was a knot in her chest she could not name. It had nothing to do with the spectacle of a horse standing on the marble floor of a superior courtroom. It had to do with the way this handcuffed, sun-scorched man was looking at her. Not with menace, not with accusation, but with something far more disorienting than either. He was looking at her with recognition. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Okafor, had not raised her gavel. She was looking at the horse's left flank, burned into the black hide, in a pattern older than every glass tower and corporate filing and billion-dollar land claim that had anything to do with this case, was a brand. A circular mark with an angular V at its center and the number of an Arizona livestock registration surrounding it in a ring, registered and permanent. The color of copper against the black coat. Any Arizona ranching attorney in the gallery knew exactly what they were looking at. Under the territorial livestock statutes preserved in Arizona's foundational land law, statutes that had never been repealed, only buried under a century of corporate real estate practice, a registered livestock brand, tied to a verified land parcel, constituted a legally binding and unforgeable deed of ownership. The brand was not a symbol. It was not a gesture. It was a document. It was, under the precise and undisturbed language of Arizona territorial law, the title itself. Elric Vane had not brought a document to this courtroom. He had brought the deed itself, on 4 legs, breathing. The billion-dollar empire built on his stolen ancestral soil had just been walked into the room by its rightful owner, in handcuffs, and set quietly in the center of the aisle. He waited 32 years to testify. Before we uncover how all this began, tell us in the comments what town or city you're watching from today. And if you believe that every action carries a consequence, hit that subscribe button to join our community before the next case opens. To understand how a handcuffed man and a desert horse paralyzed a billion-dollar empire, we have to go back 32 years to a dusty fence line in Apache Junction, Arizona, where a young rancher refused to sell his land, and the people who wanted it decided they would simply take it instead. The Vane ancestral ranch sat on 400 acres in the rugged, dust-choked valleys outside Apache Junction, hard against the western foothills of the Superstition Mountains. 3 generations of Vanes had worked that land. Elric had inherited it at 19. 3 horses, a small cattle herd, a registered livestock brand filed with the Arizona Department of Agriculture since 1953. The brand was not paperwork to him. It was identity. The physical proof that a family had worked a piece of ground long enough that the ground had become inseparable from the name. He was 28 years old the summer this story began. He knew that land the way a man knows his own skeleton. He had married Claire Sterling 2 years earlier. Claire's father, Arthur Sterling, was a corporate developer from the Eastern establishment who had come west with old money and sharper instincts. He had accepted the marriage with measured grace and made his private feelings clear over a long dinner in Scottsdale. He did not understand men who stayed in one place. Elric and Claire had a daughter. They named her Victoria. She was 3 years old the summer that everything ended. Bright-eyed and already fearless on horseback, already carrying her father's habit of watching the Superstition Mountains in the early morning when the light changed on the rock faces. Arthur Sterling's geological survey team discovered what lay beneath Elric's land on a Tuesday in late July. What they found was not a seasonal water table. It was a deep, pressurized underground aquifer of extraordinary volume. And beneath that aquifer, embedded in the sedimentary rock, ran a vein of rare industrial minerals that the emerging technology sector in Scottsdale and Tempe was already paying extraordinary premiums to secure. Elric Vane was sitting on a fortune he had no idea he possessed. The Sterlings intended to possess it for themselves. Arthur Sterling presented the offer in his Scottsdale office. 3 pages of ivory letterhead. 7 figures. Generous enough, on its face, to start over somewhere less valuable. The offer assumed that Elric Vane was the kind of man who could be separated from his land by the right number. Elric read every page. He set the offer back on the desk. He thanked Arthur Sterling for his time. He drove home. He never called. That silence was the trigger. The Sterlings did not raise their voices. They did not make threats. They were quieter than that, more methodical, more dangerous. They made phone calls to a county judge carrying a gambling debt, to a forensic lab technician whose daughter had medical bills that needed paying, to 2 officers in the Pinal County Sheriff's Department who had been looking for a way up. They were the kind of people who solve complicated problems not through confrontation, but through architecture. The slow, deliberate construction of circumstances that would leave a man with no ground left to stand on and no institution left to stand on it with him. In September of that year, Claire Sterling Vane disappeared. The official story was assembled quickly and cleanly. She was last seen at a gas station outside Mesa. Her car was found 3 days later near the Salt River, driver's door open, purse on the passenger seat. No body, no ransom demand, no note. The forensic evidence was staged with care by the people the Sterlings had paid, pointed steadily and deliberately toward the husband. The serial numbers on the evidence samples were consistent. The witness statements were too consistent. The forensic timelines meshed with a precision that real tragedies rarely achieve, because real tragedies are messy and human and full of contradiction. This one had not been engineered for truth. It had been engineered for conviction. The truth would not surface for 32 years. Arthur and Evelyn Sterling had sent Claire to Switzerland under a false identity, with a bank account registered to a name that did not exist and a story that her husband had become dangerous and unstable. Claire, who had always been more afraid of her parents than she had ever admitted to Elric, complied. She took nothing with her. She left Victoria behind. Victoria was quietly removed from the ranch and enrolled in a closed-campus boarding school in Connecticut. She was told her mother was gone and her father was a violent man. She was told this in small doses over many years by her grandparents and their carefully selected staff. The story was not delivered as a single cruel announcement. It was built into her, layer by layer, the way you build a foundation, slowly, below the surface, until the structure above it is too heavy to move without everything collapsing. By the time Victoria was old enough to question what she had been told, the story was already part of who she was. It was not something she believed. It was something she was. The Pinal County Sheriff's Department served the murder warrant on a Thursday morning in October. The young deputy who drove out to the Apache Junction Ranch that morning was Marcus Vance. He was fresh on the force, the son of a high school football coach and a registered nurse, and he believed, with the clean conviction of a man not yet fully educated by the world, that the evidence he had been handed was evidence. He did not yet know how to recognize the difference between a real case and a constructed one. He would spend the next 32 years learning to see that difference from the memory of this one morning. Elric was in the corral when Marcus arrived. He read the warrant. He looked at the deputy's face. The system declared him a dangerous fugitive. Marcus built the case the way you build a wall in the desert, slowly, with tested materials, each course checked before the next one is laid. He traced the offshore accounts through 3 separate financial intelligence agencies, filing discovery motions under sealed federal writs so that nothing surfaced before the complete picture was assembled. He contacted Interpol's Financial Crimes Unit regarding a cluster of Swiss accounts registered to a woman identified as Elise Moreau, who had arrived in Geneva in the autumn of 1992, under documentation that did not survive close scrutiny, and who had died of natural causes in a private clinic outside Zurich in 2009. Her DNA, pulled from the clinic's archived intake records through a mutual legal assistance treaty, was submitted for comparison. The results came back without ambiguity. The genetic profile of Elise Moreau matched the profile on file from the original Arizona missing persons investigation for Claire Sterling Vane. Claire was not murdered. She had been relocated by her own parents, stripped of her identity, and installed in a country where she knew no one, under a name that belonged to no one, with a story designed to ensure she never came home. She died alone, in a clinic outside Zurich, 17 years after her parents had shipped her there. She never returned to Arizona. She never saw her daughter again. And the man her parents had accused of her murder had spent 32 years living in the mountains above the ranch her parents had stolen. Elric Vane was not a murderer. He had never been a murderer. He had been a man standing in the way of something his in-laws wanted, and they had removed him the way people of their kind remove obstacles, cleanly, thoroughly, and with enough institutional support to make the removal look inevitable. Now consider what Marcus Vance knew at this moment, and what he had yet to reveal to anyone. He knew that the woman Victoria Sterling believed was her murdered mother had in fact died of natural causes in Switzerland, after being hidden away by the grandparents Victoria had spent her entire life trusting. He knew that the man Victoria had spent her entire career being told was a violent criminal was in fact an innocent man, still alive, still in Arizona, still waiting. And he knew that Victoria herself, this sharp and capable prosecutor who was at this very moment preparing to stand in a Maricopa County courtroom and argue for the permanent legal extinction of Elric Vane's claim to his family's land, was the 3-year-old girl in the photograph on the saddle horn. She was arguing against her own father. She was doing it on behalf of the people who had destroyed him. She did not know any of this. And for the moment, that was exactly what Marcus needed. He drove east into the desert. He found Elric Vane at the second canyon crossing above the high meadow where the horse grazed. Elric had heard Marcus's approach for 20 minutes. They looked at each other for a long time across the open desert floor. Marcus did not reach for his weapon. He did not reach for his cuffs. He reached into his breast pocket, took out his gold federal badge, and set it in the dust between them. Then he apologized. A human one, from a man who had handed over a warrant he should have questioned to a man who deserved better from the law he had grown up believing in. Elric looked at the badge in the dust for a long time. Then he picked it up and handed it back. Then they got to work. The legal problem was precise. Elric was still a fugitive under an active 32-year-old warrant. Any attempt to surface his evidence through normal civil channels would be immediately neutralized by the Sterling's legal team. The moment Elric Vane appeared in any conventional proceeding, he would be detained, processed, and removed from the room before he could speak. The Sterlings had spent 32 years making sure of it. Marcus had the solution. It was not a loophole. It was the law, exactly as written. Because Elric remained a fugitive under an active federal warrant, Marcus had full legal authority to take him into custody. As a federal marshal transporting a federal fugitive, he had broad authority to convey that fugitive and any evidence material to the underlying case. directly to the appropriate court without routing through local law enforcement. Local police could not interfere. County sheriffs could not intercept or delay a federal transport. The Sterling's contacts inside the county sheriff's department were entirely powerless against the federal marshal's transport authority. And the horse, registered under a brand tied documentarily and legally to the original Vane land grant, with an unbroken chain of registration running from 1953 to the present day, was not simply an animal. Under the preserved territorial livestock statutes, it was a physical instrument of land title. It was, in the precise language of the statute, evidence. Admissible evidence that Marcus Vance, as the transporting federal officer, had full legal authority to bring into the courtroom alongside his prisoner. The brand on that horse's flank was older than Sterling Quantum Holdings. It predated the corporate filings, the falsified probate transfers, the bought-off county judges, and every layer of legal architecture the Sterlings had spent 32 years constructing on top of Elric's stolen land. A billion-dollar modern empire, for all its glass and steel and political influence, could not supersede a territorial livestock registration that had never been legally extinguished. The deed had been on that animal's flank the entire time. It had simply been waiting in the mountains for someone to walk it into the right room. Marcus handcuffed Elric at the canyon crossing. Elric held out his wrists with the settled calm of a man who has had 32 years to make peace with a great many things. They loaded the Winchester on the saddle, tied the photograph to the saddle horn, and walked out of the Superstition Mountains together. A federal marshal, a 60-year-old man in handcuffs, and a black horse carrying 32 years of assembled proof toward the city that had been built on the land it legally owned. They drove to Phoenix in the early morning. At 9:47, they reached the Maricopa County Superior Court. Marcus did not knock. The doors of the Maricopa County Superior Courtroom crashed open. The horse stood in the center aisle under the fluorescent lights. The gallery of 300 people was completely silent. Marcus Vance was holding up his badge. Elric Vane was standing in handcuffs, beside the animal that carried his family's deed on its flank, and he was wearing that quiet and settled smile. The first time you encountered this scene, it was inexplicable. Now you understand it completely. This is 32 years of patience walking through a door. Every line on that weathered face earned. Every salt mark dried into the horse's neck earned. Every crack in the frame of the photograph on the saddle horn earned. Across 3 decades, alone, in the mountains, waiting for this exact morning. The handcuffs are not a defeat. They are the mechanism Marcus designed to bring Elric here. And the smile is not defiance. It is the expression of a man who has known, with absolute certainty, how this would end, and has simply been waiting for the world to arrive at the same conclusion. Victoria Sterling was still standing at the prosecution table. The knot in her chest had become something heavier and more specific, and she still could not name it. It was pulling her eyes toward the photograph on the saddle horn. Dusty, cracked at one corner. A little girl in yellow desert grass, squinting into the sun, holding a large, calloused hand. She has seen that jaw before. She is looking at it right now. Marcus Vance walked to the evidence table. He placed a modern encrypted flash drive into the courtroom's digital evidence port and entered the decryption key. 4 screens mounted at the corners of the room activated at once. The first screen showed the offshore financial routing map, the intermediary accounts, the chain of transfers, and at its center, Arthur Sterling's beneficial ownership record, dated to the autumn of 1992. The second screen showed the Pinal County Forensic Lab cross-reference records and the encoded payment confirmation attached to the miscoded administrative file, the paper trail of the case that was built against Elric Vane and the money that built it. The third screen showed the Interpol Financial Intelligence Summary, the Swiss clinic intake record, and the DNA confirmation, a woman named Elise Moreau, whose genetic profile matched the Arizona missing persons record for Claire Sterling Vane. Natural causes. Zurich, 2009. Claire was not murdered 32 years ago. She was hidden, and she died alone, across the world, with a name that was not her own. The fourth screen showed 2 documents placed side by side. On the left, a birth record filed in Maricopa County, Arizona, in 1989. The child's name, Victoria Claire Vane. Father, Elric James Vane. Mother, Claire Sterling Vane. On the right, a Connecticut boarding school enrollment record from 1993 for a child listed as Victoria Claire Sterling. Emergency contact, Arthur Malcolm Sterling, listed as maternal grandfather. The courtroom absorbs this the way the desert absorbs rain, slowly at first, and then all at once. Victoria looks at the birth record. She reads her own name. She looks at Elric Vane. He is not performing grief. He is a man looking at his daughter across 32 years of engineered distance, and the tears are moving down his weathered face with the quiet certainty of something that has been waiting a very long time to fall. He does not look away. He has been waiting to look at her for 32 years, and he is not going to look away now. She looks at the photograph on the saddle horn, the yellow desert grass, the flat Arizona light, a small girl squinting into the sun, holding a large, calloused hand. She looks at the angle of the young man's wrist, the line of his jaw, just barely visible at the edge of the frame. She has seen that jaw before. She is looking at it right now. What her grandparents built in her over 32 years, the story of a violent man, a dead mother, a dangerous past better forgotten and never examined, begins to come apart. Not loudly. The way the desert comes apart after hard rain. Silently, completely, leaving something raw and entirely real beneath the surface. The foundation her grandparents laid inside her, constructed layer by careful layer across 3 decades of controlled information, is meeting for the first time the weight of documented fact. And it is not holding. The gallery erupts, not in celebration, but in the specific, disorienting noise of a room full of people processing a revelation that restructures everything they thought they understood about the proceeding they came to watch. Journalists are typing. The Sterling legal team at the co-counsel table is on its feet, objections rising. The judge is staring at the DNA confirmation on the screen nearest her bench and doing the arithmetic that the court now has no choice but to do. In the third row of the gallery, Arthur and Evelyn Sterling are sitting very still. Their expressions hold the practiced composure of people who have spent decades presenting a specific face to the world regardless of what is happening behind it. Arthur's right hand rests on his knee. His left hand closes, slowly, around the armrest of the gallery bench. The composure is a structure. The structure has nothing left beneath it. 2 federal agents who arrived separately and took seats in the back of the gallery stand at Marcus's signal. They move through the crowd toward the third row with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this many times before and feel no need to announce it. Arthur Sterling does not stand when they approach. He looks at the nearest agent with an expression of contempt that no longer has anything to sustain it. Evelyn closes her eyes. The handcuffs close in the courtroom that the Sterlings' money helped build, in the county that their influence had shaped for 30 years, in front of every journalist who drove to Phoenix that morning expecting to watch a routine asset protection case resolve in a predictable direction. Judge Patricia Okafor strikes her gavel 4 times. The room comes to order. She calls for the federal evidence to be formally logged. She makes a notation on the active warrant for Elric James Vane. Then she looks at him across the courtroom. This 60-year-old man in a faded denim jacket who walked in from the desert with a horse and a photograph and 32 years of carefully assembled truth. And she says 3 words. Warrant is vacated. Marcus Vance removes the handcuffs from Elric Vane's wrists with the same deliberate care he brought to putting them on, standing in the dust of the Superstition Mountains. Elric looks down at his bare wrists. The marks from the steel are already fading. Across the room, Victoria Sterling has moved to the edge of the prosecution table. She is not rushing toward him. She is simply standing closer than she was, as if the distance between them has become something she can no longer justify maintaining. Elric does not hurry her. He has waited 32 years. He can wait another moment. He is patient, quietly, completely, unbreakably patient, in the way the desert is patient with everything that crosses it. She takes 1 step, then another. The demolition orders for Sterling Quantum Holdings are issued by the Maricopa County Superior Court 6 months later, pursuant to a federal ruling on fraudulently obtained land titles, a ruling that moves with rare efficiency because the documentation Marcus Vance assembled leaves no procedural room for delay. The glass and steel towers come down in sections over 3 weeks, and the local news covers every day of it. The land is not restored overnight. It takes longer than the demolition always does. The aquifer is capped and protected under a federal conservation order. The mineral rights are transferred back to the Vane estate. The desert, patient as always, begins its slow and certain return. The scrub and the dust, and the volcanic rock, and the particular quality of light across the valley floor in the early morning. The light that Elric Vane had known his entire life. He stands on it the morning the restoration order is executed. The horse stands beside him. The brand on its flank catches the early light. Victoria rides beside him. She had learned to ride at the boarding school in Connecticut, drawn to it by a half-remembered love she could never trace to its source. She knows its source now. It is a field of yellow desert grass and a photograph on a saddle horn and a man who carried 32 years of patience into a courtroom and set it down without raising his voice. They ride until Phoenix disappears behind them, until there is nothing in any direction but the open desert and the ancient mountains and the enormous, indifferent, permanent Arizona sky. The balance is settled. It always is. It always was. Not under the city lights. Not out on the frontier. Somewhere in the space between, where patience ends and justice begins, where a registered brand on an animal's flank outlasts a billion-dollar empire, and where 32 years of doing the right thing quietly turns out to be enough. Because whether it is under the blinding glare of city lights or out on the unforgiving frontier, the balance is always settled. If you stayed until the end, thank you. More stories from Breach and Balance are already on your screen. Click one now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, don't miss what's coming next. See you there.